Hello, everyone. This is another amazing episode of Educational Assessment with Professor DeNobile. I'm your host, Professor DeNobile, and this is technically episode 5, even though episode 4 was just a non-DeNobile YouTube video. But this is episode 5 of Educational Assessment. Unpacking the standards. Now that you've become familiar with backwards design or UBD, understanding by design, we now have to start going through the process. You begin at the end. The end is where you want your students to end up, and therefore the end are the standards. Today we're going to learn how do we unpack the standards in order to see how do we create rigorous assessments and questions. And I want you to really see questions, like creating questions for lessons, as a form of assessment. So even though, I mean, we've talked about this before, when we think of assessment, we tend to think about like tests and quizzes, whether they're formal or informal. But assessment is we said assessment drives instruction. Assessment is any time you are trying to gauge a level of understanding of the standards. So creating questions for your lesson is a form of assessment. It's immediate assessment within that lesson where you're drawing data every time you ask a question. And so therefore, for really, really effective lessons, we need to script those questions and have them on hand so that we make sure that within a given lesson, we are hitting those standards based off of the questions that we ask, while also creating formal assessments that are going to measure how much the students have learned or were able to perform a type of task based on those standards. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. How do we unpack those standards so that we can start creating assessments or individual questions within a lesson that are standards based? So our agenda today, how to unpack the standards. Then we're going to go to DOK and Bloom's, as well as the Hess Rigor Matrix. And then we're going to look at, once we look at the Hess Rigor Matrix, how do we use the Hess Rigor Matrix to create rigorous assessments, including tasks and questions for lesson plans. So 99% of the time, you are not going to be walking into a brand new school having to develop curriculum from scratch. Oftentimes, curriculum maps have already been created by the school and school district that you would be working for. So you're either going to be working with established curriculum, transitioning curriculum, which means they already have an established curriculum, but maybe the standards have changed. So maybe educational policy in that state has changed, or an individual school has taken upon themselves that we want to update our curriculum. Or you might be building new curriculum on your own within an established school district. With that said, we have to play the what if game. So what if I put you on a deserted island and you're building a school from scratch? You should be able to know the steps on how to build rigorous curriculum. Step 1. Now, here comes ideally. So that's what you're often going to be looking at. Now, ideally, curriculum is built within professional learning communities. That's what a PLC is, a professional learning community. Now, ideally, schools are set up with different professional learning communities. Now, for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to say this. Technically, a professional learning community can be broken up by department. So an English department, if it's run well, it's run like a professional learning community. We could think of grade level as another professional learning community. So collaboratively, different disciplines, but who teach the same grade level would be a professional learning community. We could also think of it in terms of school level, that may be too large to organize, but you may have a professional learning community of representatives of the larger school. So professional learning communities is outside of the scope of this particular course, but there are formal, I would say, characteristics. There are formal characteristics for really effective professional learning communities when they're done correctly. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to say that we all work in professional learning communities if we literally translate the word. But I just want to let you know, in other courses, you might be learning what exactly professional learning communities are. Now, ideally, as I said, you would be developing curriculum collaboratively, but you also need to be an educated, critical consumer who independently thinks for themselves. So, as I said before, you need to be able to independently build curriculum. How do you take standards, unpack them, and then develop a rigorous curriculum that is standards based? When we unpack them, we're developing our goals. What do we want our students to know? What do we want them to understand? And what do we want them to be able to do? That all comes from the standards. So it's not like I'm just going to sit. Let's pretend I'm your principal. Okay, you're building curriculum. Do it. Like, no, it all comes from the standards themselves. We clarify them with depth of knowledge, that's DOK, and Bloom's taxonomy. And then Karen Hess developed a rigor matrix where you basically have DOK on one side, Bloom's taxonomy on the other, and you're able to see how do they interact with each other in order to develop what we call rigor. Rigor is not simply making something more difficult. It's not, just doing a lot more work. That's not what rigor is. Rigor is, to keep it simple, what rigor is how do we get students to thinking critically, to performing tasks that are high level. That's what rigor is. Rigor is a high level, not necessarily a difficult level, because you can have a simple task that could be high rigor. You can have a difficult task that could be very low rigor in nature. And we'll see when we get to the rigor matrix. You want to develop learning objectives or learning targets that are in student-friendly language. So think of the standards as teacher speak. The standards are meant for educators. But when we're sharing those standards with students, we want to develop learning targets based on the standards, but have it in kid-friendly language. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean dumbing the standard down for the students. What it really means is, because sometimes we want to use the jargon, we want to use the discipline-specific vocabulary and language sometimes. But sometimes you're going to see words in a standard that the students really don't need to know. So it's our job as educators to really break down some of those teacher speak words that are meant for us, but really it helps the students access the standard. And then this last part is transfer. Once students are able to know and understand and be able to do things, how are they going to be able to transfer it to the next level, to another discipline, to real life? And you should, all of this you should have seen in the last module, or the last part of the module with understanding by design, because really that's what this is. So what do we want students to know? This is acquisition. What do we want them to know? What do we want them to be able to do? That's the acquisition level. What do we want them to understand? That's the meaning level of our desired results. And then the transfer, students will be able to independently use their learning in order to do what after they've completed the entire test. That's why in desired results, transfers us, because remember, we're thinking backwards. So after they're done, what will they be able to do? While they're doing this unit of study or this entire course, if it's a curriculum map, what will they be able to understand in the midst? What meaning are they going to be studying in the midst of it? And then what are they going to be able to know, and what will they be able to do when all is said and done? So we start with standards. And before we dive deep, I don't know if you've looked at standards before. And I'm just going to take this moment. Here's a little learning moment. No matter what level you're teaching, even if I'm teaching 12th graders, even if I know they've learned how to write an essay in an earlier year, I'm going to assume they know nothing about how to write an essay. And the reason why you work on that assumption, not because you think the students are stupid. That's not why you're working on that assumption. You're working on that assumption because you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if you assume the students are walking into this grade level knowing nothing, then you have to be able to build up around that. And you'll be able to assess it as you go along. Yes, you're going to be giving diagnostic exams. Yes, you're going to be giving things as you go along, because it's obviously students aren't coming into any given grade level. Even if they're entering pre-K and kindergarten, they're coming with some level of knowledge. But by assuming that your students know nothing, it helps you build curriculum where you're going to meet them where they need to be, not necessarily where you want them to be. Now, when we're reading standards, this is how a standard is written. So it's written in a code, RL 19. So the first part is the domain. The second part is the grade level. Then you have the standard number. Then you have the language of the standard. So as I said, I'm assuming that you've never seen a standard before. So I'm just going to break it down for you. So here, the domain is reading literature or reading literary texts, depending on how you want to interpret the RL, but it's reading literature. So we're not reading nonfiction or informational texts. That would be RI. So this is RL, reading literature. This is the grade level. So this is first grade, this is second grade, this is seventh grade, this is 9 and 10. And you're going to notice this. Grades 1 through 8 have separate standards each year. When you get to high school, there's going to be a 9-10 standard, meaning you have 2 years in order to achieve this standard of 9th and 10th, and then 11th and 12th. With that said, when you're unpacking the standards, let's say within your department, I did this year with the other members of my English department. We unpacked the standards for 9, 10, and 11 and 12 backwards planning. So we started with 12th grade, saying this is where we want all of our students to be by the time they graduate. Now, how can we parcel out 11th grade standards? What are our goals for 11th grade based on the 9th and 11th grade strand? Where do we want them to be in 10th? Where do we want them to be in 9th? So that once we know where we want them to be in 9th, we can now transition and work with the 8th grade teachers and say, here's where they need to be at the beginning of, here's where we need them to be if we want them to succeed by the end of 9th. Here's where we need you to have them by the end of 8th, and you work back to the other grade levels. You will notice here that standard 9 each year is about compare and contrast. Now, the 9th, 10th grade, you don't see the word compare and contrast, but I'm just going to skip here for a second just so that you see. Analyze how an author draws on and transforms source material in a specific work, like how Shakespeare treats a theme or topic from Ovid or the Bible, or how a later author draws on a play from Shakespeare. So even though the standard does not say compare and contrast, we could interpret it to say that we're going to analyze how an author draws on or transforms source material by comparing and contrasting the source material to the final product. So compare and contrast Shakespeare with Ovid or the Bible. Ovid, Ovid, it's probably Ovid, tomato, tomato. Or how does a later work draw on Shakespeare? So we're going to compare and contrast a modern work of literature, let's say West Side Story and Romeo and Juliet. So how does West Side Story draw upon Shakespeare? We're going to have to compare and contrast the two works to show how it drew upon, how West Side Story drew upon Shakespeare. But you'll notice to get here, it all started up here in first grade. Compare and contrast the adventures and experiences of characters. I'm sorry that it's jumping to the next slide. I don't want it to. So compare and contrast the adventures and experiences of characters in a story. This is a very low level, but very necessary understanding of how to develop the skill of compare and contrast in first grade. Once they're able to compare and contrast characters in a story, they can compare and contrast two or more versions of the same story, like different Cinderella stories. Let's say the Disney version of Cinderella and the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, by different authors or from different cultures. So we could say different authors within the same culture, or different authors from different cultures, just to like clarify that one. By 7th grade, compare and contrast the fictional portrayal of time, place, or character and a historical account of the same period as a means of understanding how authors of fiction use or alter history. So here, the content is going to be history and historical fiction, but we're using that to develop the skill of compare and contrast. The standard is still about compare and contrast. It's how are we getting to compare and contrast? We're getting it through historical fiction and actual history. By 7th grade, you can see, we didn't show the 8th grade standard, but that 7th grade standard is definitely a stepping stone toward that 9th and 10th grade standard, because here they're comparing and contrasting how does an author use or alter history to tell their story. So by 9th and 10th, how does an author use source material to develop their story? It's just a deeper level of the same skill. So how do we unpack the standard? Let's look at that 2nd grade standard, compare and contrast two or more versions of the same story by different authors or from different cultures. So we want to break down What do we want the students to know? What do we want them to understand? And what do we want them to do? Now, the standard gives us clues. So here's a little bit of a cheat sheet. The verbs in the standard is what we want them to do. So students will be able to, that's what the SWOBOT is, students will be able to do this. What do we want them to do? Compare and contrast two or more versions of the same story. We get that straight from the standard. That's what we want them to do. That's what we want them to perform. Now we can figure out how we want them to do it by developing a rigorous task or different levels of rigor throughout that unit. If this is the standard that we want to focus on in that unit, we're going to get there in a second. The nouns and the context of the standard provide what we want the students to know and understand. So students will be able to know that stories are retold in similar and different ways. That's what compare and contrast is in the background there. In different cultures. That's not ways in different cultures. And then students will be able to understand what's the context of this standard. That culture influences storytelling. That's the context of the standard. So by writing this out, what we want them to know, understand, and do, it helps us build on, it unpacks the standard, as we said on top, but more importantly, it really starts us to break down what do we want to do in a particular lesson, in a particular unit, in a particular course of study. What is the standard telling us? That's why it's important to unpack the standard, because if you go through the standards as a whole, it's like climbing a mountain. It's like, geez, what is this trying to tell us? But when we start cutting them down individually, we start to see patterns, but more importantly, it starts to give us clues of what's the type of curriculum for this grade level do they want us to do. This now brings us to Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy starts on the bottom. There's the remember stage, the understand. I'm calling them stages. They're not really stages. They're just higher levels of taxonomy, if you will. So Bloom's 1, if you will, Bloom's level 1 is remembering. That's just simple recall. Bloom's 2 is understanding. So instead of just recalling, instead of just being able to remember your 2 times tables, now explain the ideas and concepts. Why is 2 times 2 equal 4? Why is that? How do you get 2 times 2 to equal 4? Can you explain it to me? Then we get to Bloom's 3, which is the apply level. Use information in a new situation. So now I may say, I have this. I don't know why this is. I have 2 rabbits, and the rabbit they make 2. They multiply. They make 2 baby rabbits. All right. Or if I have 2 pieces of chocolate, how do I get 4 pieces of chocolate? That's probably a better one for for school purposes. But the whole point is this: how are we going to have them apply what they understood at the previous level? Then Bloom's 4 is the analyze level. So drawing connections among ideas. So now, they're going to differentiate. They're going to compare and contrast. So the standard that we're looking at was already at a Bloom's level of 1, 2, 3, 4, a Bloom's level of 4. However, you're going to see when we get to the rigor matrix, it's not about deciphering where the standard is at. It's not deciphering the level of the standard. It's taking the standard and creating tasks and questions that are going to be at rigorous levels. Again, when we get there, I'll show you. Then Bloom's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bloom's 5 is the evaluate stage. This is very high. You constantly want to strive for the analysis and evaluate stage. So justify a stand or decision. In a lot of times, this is like argumentative writing. And then create stage, produce new or original work, design something, assemble something, construct something, conjecture, like come up with a new idea, write a short story, investigate. I taught you how to perform a scientific experiment, design and come up with your own. Here's a problem, formulate a solution to this problem. So these are Bloom's taxonomy. I'm gonna say from now, Bloom's taxonomy is one of the most basic concepts you need to master in order to develop really effective and rigorous assessments. This now brings us to Webb's depth of knowledge. It's 4 levels. Webb's DOK1 is the recall and reproduce level. So it's the simple who, what, where, when, why, how. That's why it's level 1. It's you're not asking much. So if we're thinking about this in a if we're looking at a story, who are the characters? Tell me, who are the characters? What are they doing? Where do they live? When do they live? It's a simple recall. It's very low level. Now, in elementary school, DOK1 maybe satisfactory. When you get to the higher levels, middle school and high school, they're going to train you very simply and say you're only going to use DOK1 sparingly when you have to. I rarely ever use DOK level 1 questions when I develop lesson plans or when I develop assessments, because they don't demonstrate anything for me in terms of thinking. DOK2, apply knowledge and skills with basic reasoning. How did it take place? Why did it take place? How does it operate? Why does it operate? Definitely better than level 1. But again, it's a very low ceiling. You're not really getting much more than what you were getting in DOK1. DOK3 is when we start seeing really deep critical thinking skills. How can I make use of it to solve a problem? Why does it solve the problem? What is the cause, effect, or reason? What are the intended and unexpected outcomes? Level 3 is really where you start digging deep in their depth of knowledge. And then DOK4 is extensive thinking creatively to transfer knowledge across content areas and over time. What do you think, feel, or believe? What will or could happen? What is the relationship? How did it influence? What if this happens? What if that happens? Now, typically think of DOK4 also as long-term thinking. So anything that's a long-term project is going to be at a DOK4, because you're asking them to perform different tasks and to synthesize what they're doing in those tasks. And I'm going to say more about Bloom's and DOK later on in the presentation. So now this brings us now to Hess. So where can I hide myself for now? Just know that this says DOK level 4 extended thinking. So Karen Hess developed this matrix by using Bloom's taxonomy on the left side. And you'll notice the remember level, understand level, apply level, analyze level, evaluate level, and the create level. And then she put Webb's DOK across the top. So here there's the recall and reproduction level, the skills and concepts level, the strategic thinking and reasoning level, and then the extended thinking level. And you'll notice that sometimes, like for example, Bloom's 1 is only at a DOK level 1. There is no Bloom's level for DOK level 2 for remember. There's no 3, 4 because the remember stage is simply recall. So that's why there's nothing on these. At the understand level, you can construct an assessment or a question for understanding that is at the recall level. So, for example, identify or describe literary elements. Describe the characters, describe the setting, that's just that it's demonstrating understanding. So it's more than simply tell me the name of the character. That's a recall question. Tell me the name of the character. Now you're doing this is a little bit better, but it's still a recall question. It's just an understanding recall question. When we get to level 2, let's see. Summarize the results, concepts, and ideas. Okay, summary is definitely higher than a simple recall of understanding. But summary is an understanding question. If you can summarize something, you're demonstrating that you understood what it meant. So it's adding skills and concepts. At the level 3, now let's see, like describe how word choice, point of view, or bias may affect the reader's interpretation of the text. So now we're really starting to dig deep in their strategic thinking and reasoning. This particular question is still simply an understanding question. So it's only a Bloom level 2, but it's a DOK level 3. And then for a Bloom's 2 for understanding, a DOK level 4 would be explain how concepts or ideas specifically relate to other content domains or concepts. So for example, if you're doing something in English, you want to ask them, how does this apply to history? How is what you that's that transfer level. So how are we going to extend our thinking, and how are we going to really transfer this to another discipline? But again, this is simply the understanding level. You will notice when we get down to the evaluate level automatically starts at level 3. So evaluation is always going to be a higher level concept for students to demonstrate. And then you have the create level here. I'm going to talk more about the Hess matrix later on. So I just want to quickly demonstrate looking at a low grade level and a high grade level standard. We're going to go back to that standard 9, the compare and contrast. So how can we create questions and tasks? Both are assessments. How can we create questions and tasks using these standards, unpack them, and then use the Hess Rigor Matrix in order to create those tasks and questions? So Here's how we do it. So unpacking this is telling us for first grade, the standard is to compare and contrast the adventures and experiences of characters and stories. So we know they need to compare and contrast, and that they need to compare and contrast adventures and experiences of the characters in the stories that they're reading in first grade. So this now depends on, now as the teacher, I have some choices that I can do. So I can do, let's see. If it's a compare and contrast, first thing I can do, if it's, we could do a lot of level 1 here where we're just, but see, no, it's compare and contrast. My point is that this is where we have to start thinking out loud and looking at what are our choices. So it's going to be down here, because it's going to be at the analyze stage that we do compare and contrast, because we saw that before on the Bloom's matrix. So we're automatically going to be at this stage. Now the question is, for first grade, like, what I'm not going to do out of the gate, because I'm teaching first grade in this scenario, I'm not going to have students write a research paper comparing and contrasting the adventures and experiences of the characters, having them gather from multiple sources. Now, I may do something light with them where they're going to gather information from multiple sources, but I'm going to make it age appropriate for the first graders. But that's not going to be the first thing that I do with them. What I may do with them is I may do a Venn diagram. I'm going to have 2 characters and ask them to compare and contrast their adventures and experiences in the story. How are they similar? How are they different? And for those first grade classes, I'm probably going to stay within DOK 1 or 2. But what I'm looking at for the 9th and 10th graders, I'm going to want to push them. I want to get them as close to level 4 as I can. So I may have them, let's see. I may have them, cite information from the texts. Well, for this one, this is analyze how an author draws on transform source material in a specific work. So for this one, I may have them read. This one may end up being, I can see doing a level 4 for this one, where I have them read, let's say, a scene from Shakespeare, but now they have to on their own read an excerpt from Ovid or read an excerpt from the Bible, and now they have to cite the evidence, they have to pull it out, and they have to synthesize Shakespeare and the Bible, let's say, in order to show how Shakespeare used parts of the Bible to develop his scene. Like that's going to be a high level ask. But I'm not going to ask my students to do that if I know that they can't do that. So I'm going to have to break that down into smaller steps as I go along. The whole point is this: you make the choices. You have to develop the tasks while understanding that it's your responsibility to get to a level of rigor which is equal to or just beyond where your students are at. Because if you constantly stay at these low levels, the students are never going to develop the critical thinking skills that they need to do. You want to live in this middle area here, but strive to get to the lower right as often as possible. But you're really going to want to live in the middle. You don't want to live up in the upper left unless you're in elementary school, you may have to live in the upper left for long periods of time until you're seeing that your students are getting where they need to be. But once you're getting into the middle and high school years, you're really living in the middle and striving to get to the lower right. So here's a real world example. This is what I did last week with my students. So I'm teaching a college level course called Science and Literature with my high school students. And the last unit was on computers and video games. And so as the last thing they did, because we're transitioning into the new semester, so I'm losing them this semester. I'm going to get a new crew for the spring. I had them watch Ready Player One. And so for the 11th and 12th graders, yes, it's a college level course, but I'm still teaching high schoolers, so I have to consult my high school standards. They have to determine one of their standards, the R2. Now, this is next generation New York State standards. These are not Wyoming standards, but you'll probably see similar language between the two states' languages. Standards, excuse me. But here, determine two or more themes or central ideas in a text and analyze their development, including how they emerge and are shaped and refined by specific details, objectively and accurately summarize a complex text. This is what I was saying before. You have to be able to break this down into student-friendly language, because quite frankly, I don't need to do the whole standard. Every single time I do the standard. I could do parts of the standard and still meet the standard. But the spirit of the standard is determining two or more themes or central ideas in a text and analyzing them. That's the spirit of this text. So this is what their overall task was to do. I wanted them to evaluate. That's a high Bloom's, high DOK, evaluate the pros and cons of video games by analyzing at least two themes from Ready Player One. So this is definitely DOK 4, because I'm asking them to extend their thinking, and this is going to be Bloom's 4 or 5. It's going to be low on the matrix, which means it's a high level Bloom, and it's going to be towards the right side for this particular task. While watching the film, I'm telling them choose two of the following themes from Ready Player One. I gave them a link to an article which basically helps them determining these themes down here. Cite at least 5 pieces of evidence from the movie that demonstrates the theme. And then I gave them themes that they can work with, so they had someplace to start with. Now this is low level, because I'm asking them to recall and write down notes. But if they don't do this, they won't be able to do the task. So this is what I'm saying in terms of at the high school level. You need to be strategic in how you're using the tasks. Yes, this is a low-level task, but it's an important task, because if they don't take notes while they watch the movie, they can't do the high-level task. I just wanted to break that down to show you. Here's how I started with the standard. This is my content. This is what I want them to do to demonstrate the standard, but I may have to do a low-level task for them to do the high-level task. So again, the level of rigor. How do we determine the level of rigor? If I'm looking at evaluate the pros and cons of video games by analyzing at least 2 themes from Ready Player One. So because it's evaluate, the evaluate part is Bloom's 5. It's a DOK level 3, so we're over here. And it's also analyze is Bloom's 4, and a DOK level 3. But I would say combined, you're looking at I'm asking them to extend their thinking. So overall, even though individually it's only a DOK level 3 for the individual parts, overall, this task is definitely asking them to extend their thinking. Now, as I said before, for elementary school, you're going to start in the upper left and build downward. You know, elementary, you want to try to get into level 3 and level 4, but you're going to live on the left side over here. Middle school and high school, you're living in the middle and striving for the bottom right corner. And you always want to have at least one DOK 4 per unit. You really want to push your students at least one time per unit into that level 4 DOK. So when starting a new teaching position, you will often be working with established curriculum, transitioning curriculum, or building new curriculum. Nonetheless, you need to know how to build curriculum from scratch. Ideally, curriculum is built collaboratively in professional learning communities, but sometimes you may need to modify or build curriculum on your own. Always start with the standards, then unpack them by determining what students need to know, understand, and be able to do. And finally, create rigorous assessments based on the unpacked standards and aligning them on the Hess Rigor Matrix. Hess can also help you write rigorous questions within your lesson plans as a form of instructional assessment. I can tell you, 16 years into teaching that I'm at, I consult the Hess Rigor Matrix when I do my curriculum mapping, my unit planning, my lesson planning. I have the Hess Rigor Matrix out there because the Hess Rigor Matrix is going to help me develop and help me make those choices that I want to make in making sure that my tasks and my questions, my assessments, are at the level of rigor I need them to be in order for them to achieve those standards. And as always, this is another way of demonstrating that assessment drives instruction. The whole point of unpacking the standards is determining what type of assessments do we need to get to those standards. Because once we determine the type of assessments that we need to do, then we're able to instruct our students to get there. So thank you again, and I hope to see you on our next episode of Educational Assessment. Have a good night.